So I tried to give a bit of context, and now we're going to dive into the baseline coffee code revision process. So we'll start with what are the objectives that we're trying to balance here. So first, we want to be able to adapt to the ongoing crisis that we have seen the sector is facing. So you have a period of low prices, we have the climate crisis, and now more recently we have the pandemic. So we understand that there's a lot of elements that are moving at producer end. But at the same time, we also know that we need to be fit for the future. So we know that there are legislations on due diligence, in particular in consuming countries, that are going to have an effect on what can be sold in markets like in Europe and in the US. In particular, for example, the European Union has recently been having this conversation and is likely to have legislation put in place soon that is going to affect how production that can then be traded into Europe. We also have quite a number of supply chain actors that are making strong, bold commitments in terms of sustainability. But we also know that there's quite a fragmentation and proliferation of programs, and they need to demonstrate impact. So all these elements we had to consider when we're thinking how we can make the baseline coffee code fit for producers and fit for the future. The idea is to simplify without weakening the commitment that we have for sustainability, but also to advance, to move forward, to be ambitious, but to remain baseline, so that we have these foundations and we, as we mentioned before, are able to actually reach more farmers and they can have more access to sustainable practices. So this is the process that we have been, and this is the support. We have had a great support in this process. So often, usually for the baseline coffee code revision, we have a technical committee that is a subcommittee of the board. And this committee is very strong in terms of having the producer voices, and we have a couple also of voluntary sustainability schemes like Rainforest Alliance and Foresee in this technical committee. As we know that it's really important also to hear from all the elements of the supply chain, we have a volunteer group of an advisory task force that is made of roasters and retailers. We have also civil society. We also have other input to help us to understand all the elements in the supply chain that are relevant for this review. So we started this process in October, November, and we had a look at what are the changes in the sustainable landscape. What has happened, how has the conversation been evolving? And we started developing a draft with the support of the technical committee and the advisory task force. We're now just started to have our public consultation. It's a 2-month period where we are now putting to test this proposal that we have developed and hear the voices of the sector.
So she was just talking about the launch of this and how we will then be taking the input from this consultation process over the next 2 months with the this expanded advisory task force back to the technical committee to create the baseline coffee code that is future-proofed, and that will go to the board in July. So it's a very ambitious timeline. So we're going to start diving into the technical part now. So we were almost at the transition anyway. So, so the next slide, please. And I would encourage, we're going to now be talking about some of the details. So as we're starting to go into this, realizing that not everyone is as familiar with it as we saw from the poll. So please put your questions in the chat box and then we can make sure that we're addressing those as we go. It's very exciting to see we have 100 people on this call, so that's really great. As we get into the details, a couple things to just keep in the back of your mind. You've already heard some of them. The principles are all framed as outcomes now on their desired goals. We went from 37 principles in the current version down to 12 proposed. However, this does not mean anything got lost. There was quite a lot of streamlining and reorganization. And in many cases, what were principles have now become practices. And we'll go through a concrete example so it'll make it a bit more tangible. Nothing was lost. That's the thing that you'll also see in the document that we mapped it to the existing code. So nothing's lost. It was more of a reorganization to make it a little bit more robust and help everyone to understand what are we trying to achieve with this. We moved away from a traffic light system. This is a baseline coffee code, so everything is baseline. However, we did not lose the concept of continuous improvement. We recognize sustainability is a journey. It's not an endpoint, and we need to meet people where they are. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind. The scope of this is the primary production, the production and primary processing level. There is a lot of interest to look at the responsibilities of supply chain actors, but the scope for the baseline coffee code is at production and primary processing. And as always, we built upon what exists, the existing standards, the existing codes that are out there, the excellent work that already exists in the coffee world, as well as outside in agriculture and international frameworks. So we're trying to make sure that this also fits with the different other initiatives that are happening, and recognizing that it's going to require collective action to do this. And as Helga already mentioned, there are a variety of potential users. So how the baseline coffee code is taken on and used will look different depending on the user. Next slide, please. So we're going to start the high level. Not unusual. We're kind of using the typical framework of economic, social, and environmental. Those are the dimensions. Those break down into practices, and then under that we have, those are the kind of the practices to meet those principles, and then the measures are the desired results of those. So here's just a really quick overview of what we have there. So under economic, again, it was some reorganizing of things, of capturing things around management, the access to services, kind of business integrity. This also integrates all of the unacceptable practices. They are now integrated within this. But again, if you are familiar with the current baseline coffee code, you will be able to identify where they are in the new one. What we have brought forward is one on community, diversity, and inclusion, recognizing this is very important, both from at a producer level as well as throughout the supply chain. And as on the environmental side, a climate one. The climate one does integrate some of the former practices around energy as well as around soil and mitigation. So it's more of the title of it, but taking into consideration of it needs to respond to what are the needs there in the marketplaces so that producers have something that is responsive to that. So next slide, please. So we're going to go into an actual example, and I'm going to try something, the fancy Zoom thing here with Anecdote, and I'm going to kind of try to say here, we're starting with the topic here, right there, and this is around, this is the dimension of environmental responsibility and stewardship. And we will always have a goal statement on this because it's often kind of nebulous. What do we mean by this? So we're trying to be very clear about what do we mean by this. There will be then, the topic here is biodiversity as an example. This is only an example. Then we have a principle. And as had noted already, is the principles need to be stated as objectives. So we put very clearly, what is the objective here? Then you will find where is this currently in the baseline coffee code. So you will be able to find the numerations here. This is an unacceptable practice. This is here at 1.1. So you will be able to find where is it currently. We won't worry about the numbering on the practices. There's a critical column here. I'll come back to that. We've got somebody with background noise, but I think we're all used to that now by Zoom and our professional and living at home and homeschooling. So as I said, the principles are the objective and the practices are the things you would implement to reach those objectives. So here's the practices here, and there's some examples of practices to reach this objective under biodiversity. And then what would be the expected results of that? So here's the measures that we would see here. So those are the results that you would see there. So those are kind of, that's our framework of principles, practices, and then measures. A couple of other things, we have a few critical ones that have been identified yes, we recognize, we say this is baseline coffee code, but there are some expectations there. So we have in no deforestation, for example, and no child labor. Those are the types of things that are, there's only 4 that have been identified as critical. We also have a column here that's only applicable to. There are a few examples of something that is only applicable to, for example, a group manager. So rather than try to put in another type of measure here and it gets quite complicated, we just have some of those exceptions. It might only be applicable to a farm that has more than 10 workers. You can imagine some of these practices around labor might only be applicable to others. So this is just an example. But again, going from, here's the framework, going from a topic to principles to your practices. Those are the expected practices to achieve those principles, and then the measures. Those are the expected results. So I realized that was quite a lot, and I probably talked quite fast. So I'll pause there a second and see if Mary, there was any questions I need to do for clarifications. Otherwise, we can hold any other substantive questions to the end.
Yeah, we'd like to encourage you to please enter your questions into the chat box. Thank you very much, Amy, for giving us an overview of how we've proceeded to include all of the content from the original code into the format of the revised code. We wanted to make sure everyone could see what this process was and that we were sourcing and carefully annotating our progress along the way, the progress that the BCC Technical Committee and the Advisory Task Force have been making together to get to this point to present to you all for this public consultation.
All right. So where you might not see is how do we move from a traffic light system to a baseline, the continuous improvement model. So we have this principles, the objective, the practices to achieve those principles, those objectives, and then the desired results, those measures. So those are laid out in a framework. And again, to remind ourselves, this is not, there are many great initiatives out there that are implementing this. So this is a framework for them. And they will have their own systems and their own implementation mechanisms. So where certain measures are not yet in place, those would be identified, and through those initiatives, they would be defining the timelines for those. So that's how it can be a continuous improvement model. It can help to identify where are there gaps, where are there not the results that you would expect to see that in a baseline. So you can identify those, and then you can work back and say, what are the practices that you would have to achieve those results? So it can be used again as a reference framework, rather than saying this is not a compliance, this has to be met or not. It's a reference framework. So that's how we see the continuous improvement model is. It will also then allow us to have a level playing field for wherever you are in the sustainability journey, or whether you're a smallholder or a large estate.